Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus, honored to be joined today by U.S. Army veteran Ray Lambert. He was a medic in World War II, was involved in landings in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. He came ashore in the first wave with the Big Red One at Normandy on June 6, 1944. We look forward to getting into this, the entirety of all of this. And sir, thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome.
Where were you born and raised, sir?
I was born in Alabama, and I grew up there in Alabama, and I lived there until I was 20 years old until I joined the service.
And were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
Why did you choose the Army?
I chose the Army because I wanted action, and when I went to the recruiting office, they asked me what I would like to do, and I said if I'm going into service, I want to be with a fighting unit. I want to be in action.
What kind of training did you do first? Did you immediately get designated for being a medic, or did that come later?
That came after basic training. We went to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic training, and I was assigned at that time to the 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Medical District. And I had some medical training, and that's how I ended up in the medics. And we continued there after basic training of doing training in medical.
What are the main things that medics were trained to do?
At that time, we were training as first-line medics. Our job was to give first aid to the wounded and try to save their lives, give them a little bit of morphine for pain, and send them back to regimental and back to collecting hospitals where they can get more care.
When did you deploy?
We deployed after basic training here in the States. We did a lot of training moving from one part of the country to the other by convoy and by train. And eventually we went to Indianapolis, Pennsylvania, was quarantined there and left there and went overseas. And we were not really deployed as we speak about deployment until we were finished, got on over there.
Right.
Till we were over there.
So tell me about getting there and landing in North Africa.
Well, we, of course, went to England first. The ship that we was on docked in Liverpool, and we disembarked there and went by rail, a small rail train, out to Tidsworth, England. We were put in our barracks there that the British military had been using, and we did training there, live fire training, and also the medics were training with the infantry, and did basic medical training there. Little barriers, first aid, men with companies, and anything that we would be faced with when we went into action. We were there for a while doing training, and then we were with advanced detail of the 1st Division. After a while, we met the 1st Division, the rest of the 1st Division that came over with the Queen Mary in Scotland. And we did maneuvers in Scotland and for quite a while there, and then went back to England and eventually went to North Africa from there. And in North Africa, at Oran in North Africa, was our first challenge really in war.
Describe it for me.
Well, when we landed there in Arzu, which is outside of Oran, Naturally, it was our first landing, and a lot of the equipment that we had, such as our jeeps and vehicles, were on different ships. And as we went off there in our zoo, we met very little resistance. The Free French, of course, were there and with us, and it was about 3 hours after we got in that we started facing a little more action from the enemy. And the thing that we didn't have when we landed there was one of the ships that went down that had our equipment on it, our jeeps and things, so we didn't have that. So I went to a farmer there in our zoo, and he had requisitioned a horse and a cart. This was a gray horse, big wheels on the cart, and we loaded all our medical supplies on there. I gave the farmer a receipt for the horse and his wagon, and we used that on our way into Oran. And we, after, of course, we got into Oran and we settled down and got our vehicles in, we returned the horse and back to the farmer. But it was the fighting going into Oran was not really too bad. We lost only a couple of guys of our medics going in. One of those guys died when an electric wire was hit and went down, and our guys, of course, were advancing up the road and trying to stay in the lower parts of the ditches on the side of the road. And the power line went down on the guys that were in those and electrocuted them. So we lost only the 2 guys on the way into Oran. We were first, as we got into Oran, we were stationed there for a while in an old fort on top of the hill that looks out over Oran in the harbor. And while we were there, the medics had to inspect all the restaurants and other facilities there in Oran. And once that was all done, then it had been cleared for other troops coming in. The rest was safe and all this sort of stuff. And after that, we started moving forward into North Africa and Algiers area. And so the fighting, as we moved forward into North Africa and heading into Tunis, we started meeting a lot more resistance and real heavy fighting.
And from what I've read, you were decorated for your bravery there, for risking your life to get to wounded troops.
Yes, I felt that my responsibility to my men was to have to prove myself first as a leader to my men, to get their trust before I could expect them to do things. So if we were going through a Seltzer Valley, in one case, my driver and we saw a guy that was in a minefield, and the mine had blown up, and he was wounded there. So we stopped, and my driver said he was going in to get the guy, and I wouldn't let him do that. I went into the minefield, picked the guy up, followed his tracks, and followed our tracks back out. So I brought him out and saved his life, got him to the aid station, and we took care of him and sent him back. That was one of the times that I did something that I felt that my job was to protect my men, to give them their duties that would each man was best fitted for. I picked men that could take the punishment on the front line as company aid men, and guys strong enough as litter bearers to bring the guys back on litters sometime as much as a mile or more from the front lines. And I also would rotate those guys having one guy with a company aid men for 2 weeks and then bringing him back and letting him be a little bearer and sending another man as a company aid man. A company aid man in war probably is one of the most dangerous jobs that you can possibly have, where an infantry soldier can dig a trench, get in it for fighting and firing. Medics have to be visible all the time. They cannot hide themselves behind or in anything. And so that the infantry guys will know they're there. And it's very important that these company aid men live with that infantry company and get to know them, and so they get to know them. I would just like to tell you one little incident that happened in North Africa, if I may.
Sure.
On Hill 609 near Kasserine Pass in North Africa, the Germans held their high ground, and we needed the high ground, and the 16th Infantry attacked Hill 609. It was a terrible battle. The Germans were fixed positions there, and we lost a lot of men. And finally, we took the high ground from the Germans. We had an aid station set up at the base of the mountain, and the next day we had to use half tracks and any vehicle we could to bring the dead out of there. There were so many. The next day we held that hill all day long, and I went up late that night, late that evening, to check on my company aid men because the infantry companies were holding the land up there. So as I was going up the side of the mountain, there was a lot of boulders there and big rocks and things. I got to a point, and I was standing with my back to a big boulder, and I heard a kind of a scraping noise up top, and when I did, I looked back, and that put me back to that big rock. And a German came down with a fixed bayonet on a rifle and went through my field jacket and cut that out and went through the fleshy part here and fell on the ground in front of me. And he came at me again with the bayonet, and I reached to try to get the end of the rifle, and when I did, he pulled the bayonet back, and that's why this finger is like this. It almost cuts his finger off. And we had been told that the Germans snipers were killing medics, and we could take off our Geneva crosses and arm ourselves. I had a .45 that I'd armed myself with. And the second time that he went back like that, I had time, even with my hand, finger almost cut off, to get my pistol. And I got it out, and when he came at that time, I shot him twice. And he fell on the ground, rolled a couple of times on the side of the hill, and I checked him. He was dead, and I went through him, got his identification. There was one little photograph in his pocket, had him and two young women on it, and German writing on the back. I didn't understand that, but later when I got to the aid station, we decided that was him and his sister and his girlfriend. I still have that little picture today, and every time I look at it, it reminds me that that is the only person in my lifetime that I had to kill. And so while I was doing that, I was not frightened. My training had taught me to do something, react to a situation. After it was over, and I was looking at this young guy there, about probably 2 years younger than I was at that time. He might have been about 17. Here we are in a different country than our own, fighting each other for something we don't even know why sometimes. And then I started shaking, sweating, and everything else. And that didn't last very long, but that's I think the worst experience that I had.
Sir, we've talked a lot about North Africa. That ultimately led to the amphibious landing at Sicily. Tell me about your experience there, please.
Once we had finished fighting in North Africa, the next objective we had was to take Sicily. We needed bases for our planes. We needed air bases and supply bases so that we could continue on our fighting in other areas. So Sicily was next on our mark, and we left North Africa by boat. And as we got out into the ocean, many of the guys thought that we were going back to the States. We were hoping that we were going back to the States. And it wasn't long before they came around giving us some little pamphlets on Sicily, the language there, and the things that we'd be faced with. When we joined up with the rest of the division, we had two different ships. I was on the Henrico, and as we got out into the ocean, the rest of the troops met up on other ships with us. And we went to invade Sicily at Gila, and before we got in close enough to the invasion area, we could see smoke and some things ahead. So we knew that our battleships had been laying down some smoke in there and also throwing in some artillery shells into that area. So we got in close to the beach area, and we had dropped off in probably about 4 feet of water, and we began then to pick up the artillery fire and machine gun fire. And we unloaded there from the scene into smaller boats and made the invasion on the beaches there. And we were faced by 28 German tanks that was in sight of us, and they were in a horseshoe position facing the beach. And as we got in, we started picking up casualties from the machine gun fire that was coming into the troops at that time. And my job at that time was to try to find a place where we could treat those casualties and evacuate them. And there was no place there at that particular time that was safe to do that. So we were getting the wounded and getting them back as far as we could near the beach, and hoping that we'd be able to catch one of the landing craft coming in and send those back out of there. But the Germans were closing in on us at that time with their tanks, and one of the tanks got so close in that as they were unloading some of the supplies on the beach, ran right over those supplies, and they were right down on the beach. The thing that saved us there was the infantry guys were just moving forward and getting casualties, but they were. It was amazing to see to me how these guys would face those tanks with sticky bombs, as we call. They'd stick on the side of the tanks and blow them up. And they were getting up on top of the tanks and try and fire down or drop hand grenades down in the tanks. And eventually the tanks, a few of the tanks got knocked out, and the battleships were firing at the tanks. And the thing that saved us there that day was the fact that the Germans did not have foot troops in there. And it was the German army was, of course, well trained and didn't make that many mistakes at that time. And we could never understand that. But as the tanks pulled back, they brought in 50 truckloads of foot troops. And then the battle started between those guys and our infantry, ground troops. And we had begun to be able at that time to get some of the wounded back in an area where we could give them a little morphine, get them out of pain, and dress. It wasn't a question of trying to heal a person, it was trying to keep them alive. And so we could put tourniquets on at that time. And we did eventually be able, after several hours, be able to evacuate some of those.
This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined today by U.S. Army veteran Ray Lambert, who served as a medic in World War II, served in North Africa, Sicily, and the invasion of Normandy. And, sir, I know after landing in Sicily, you were wounded again. You were wounded previously in North Africa. After that, you went back to England before the invasion of Normandy. Is that right?
Yeah, we went from Sicily back to England.
Okay. And then talk about the build-up to D-Day. When did you find out that you were going to be in the first wave?
I didn't find out that I was going to be in the first wave until we had loaded the ships at Weymouth, England, to go on the invasion. General Eisenhower was very careful about these things and put the orders out that any man that talked about what we were going to do, and hopefully none of us knew enough anyway at that time where we were going to land and what day the invasion was. So we didn't really know that until we were loaded on the ships in Weymouth. Then they gave us that information.
So dawn breaks as you're in the English Channel. First of all, how was the ride over?
Well, we had very rough weather there. The invasion was set to be on the 5th of June, and the weather was the waves in the channel was probably 5 to 6 feet high, and then the clouds was very low and heavy and rainy, so it meant that we couldn't get the air support in there that we needed. So after we loaded the ships in Weymouth, we began to know more and more about what we're getting. They had sand mock-up tables on these ships, and all of the non-commissioned officers and officers would study those tables where we might be able to land. And I looked at those tables, and tried to pick a place that we could set up an aid station somewhere on the beach, which was really impossible, of course, to do after we got there and saw that. But on these ships, that night, the 5th, we stayed on this ship, and they had decided that we could not make a landing that day, and we'd make it on the 6th. After we left Weymouth, we had a convoy of ships, mine destroyers, and we had all kind of small craft with us. And we went in the night. The guys some were writing love letters home, some were playing cards, and some were reading the Bible, and some were just sitting there thinking. Those of us that had been through the other invasions had some idea of what we were going to have when we were landed there, what to expect. My job at that time, I had replacements with me that had joined us in England. We had trained them well, and I was spending a lot of time with them, trying to make sure that they, if they weren't too concerned about it. And so we went on that night on the ship, and then we anchored the next morning about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, 10 miles off the shore. And as the daylight began to come up, I went up on deck, and I couldn't believe what I saw. It looked like every ship in the world was there, and every kind of ship, and destroyers and everything else out there. And My brother was up on deck that night too, so we talked for a while about our chances on the third invasion. A lot of guys were kidding, 3 strikes you're out. This is our third invasion. So we were there until he and I talked for a while and looked at all the ships and things. It was beginning to get daylight. And then they called for the stations. I went back to where my men were and checked every man as he came up to the station where we were going to load in the Higgins boats. And I talked to him briefly, told them to keep their mind on the job, not to think of anything else, just to concentrate on your job that you're trained for. And I checked their equipment, their life jackets and life preservers and everything to make sure they were okay. And then I would send each guy down the rope ladder to land and go into that craft that he was designed to be in that night. It was very rough. The waves were beating the Higgins boats against the side of the ship. We had all our equipment on us, and as we went down the net to get into the Higgins boat, there were 2 people there that could kind of stabilize you just a little bit, and you had to pick just the right time to jump in. Otherwise, you could break your legs or be seriously hurt. And so we went down and landed in to the Higgins boat there.
And so then the Higgins boat is coming ashore. The ramp drops. What happens?
Yeah, that after we loaded on the Higgins boat, we rendezvoused there till the entire wave that was going in on that first wave was loaded on the Higgins boat. And many of the guys, practically every guy got seasick because of the smell of the diesel and the waves up and down in that small Higgins boat. And once they were all loaded, we headed full speed toward Omaha Beach. And the waves were so high that water was coming over the boat, flashing in on top of it. And guys were throwing up all over the place. And if you wasn't sick yourself, pretty soon you'd get sick. The boat, people were throwing up in the boats or throwing up over the side of the boat. And it was just a situation there where you'd get sick of everything going in. But we headed in full speed, and as we got in sight of the land, we could see puffs of smoke, and the Navy had laid down some smoke in there from some of the battleships, and that was beginning to rise and be out. So we were getting to a situation where we could see the beach area, and as we got close in, we picked up machine gun fire on the boat and some mortar fire on the Higgins boat. And when we got to the beach, we had certain slots, if we want to call them, where each of the Higgins boats would go in. And we went in, and when we got in, they dropped a ramp. I was standing in the front left corner, and I told the guys there, it's very noisy, you couldn't hear much, but I told the guys, stay underwater as much as you can. We could see the machine gun in front of us firing at us. One was to our left there at Omaha Beach, which was east. One to the west. On the other side, it was firing in, and then mortars and artillery shells were coming in. We had one boat to the left of us that was hit, went on fire, and I remember seeing one of the guys jump overboard on fire himself. Even his shoes were burning. And those guys we never saw again. But as the ramp went down, I went off. Something went through my right elbow of my arm, and that began to bleed a little bit and kind of crushed the bone. And so I immediately went underwater and moving in as far as I could that way. And the next thing that I found in front of me was a guy hung up on barbed wire. and the Germans had cross ties and what they call iron gates. All these things were in there so that hopefully the Higgins boat would tip over or not be in there. But we did get through that. And so I began to talk to my men and tell them to try to save the guys that were drowned. And there was the beach, really just everywhere you looked was dead people, dead guys, dead soldiers. And then floating in the water, there were guys that had a lot of equipment on them, and their life preservers had tipped them up in some areas, and they were drowning. So we immediately tried to save those guys. They were infantry, and we had to go to a man that was floating and get to him and turn him over when he knew where he was alive or dead. If he was dead, we left him and went to try to save the guy that was still alive and get him back on his feet and get him out. The waves were coming in, and the guys that were dead were being pushed in to the beach and then pulled back out again. And it was, I continued to work that way and going underwater and getting guys. And the third wave was coming in about the time that I was getting bleeding bad and getting weaker. But I still was working. That time I got a wound in my left thigh. Was hit out of here 14 inches. You could see the bone. And my clothes were torn. I put a tourniquet on that and gave myself a shot of morphine and went back into the water to help those guys. I was talking to my Myers, one of my corporals, and Ray Lambert was another one of the guys. I tried to motion and get them together, and the noise was with all the stuff going on and boats being hit and artillery coming in, and it was you couldn't really have a conversation in a place like that. So I talked to those guys that we had to find some place that we could get these wounded guys so that the Germans were firing straight at him. If a guy was wounded and he was on the ground, they would kill him. They would fire at him until they killed him. Bullets were flying all around us, sometimes bouncing off our helmet and shrapnel and things coming in. And so I continued doing that, and I was getting weaker all the time. And one guy was hung up on the barbed wire, and I could see his hand. He was waving in there. And I went to him, went under the water, and got him. Finally, I had to go under twice to get him loose from the barbed wire. And I found that it was like his life preserver was caught up in the barbed wire. So I unbuckled that. I took him in my bad arm, which I was using like this, and was taking him out. And as we were going out, another boat came in, a Higgins boat came in, and dropped his anchor and hit me in the back and pushed me and the guy that I had to the bottom.
The ramp hit you?
The ramp hit me in the back and pushed me to the bottom with the guy that I had. And so I was under that ramp, which weighs about 2,000 pounds or so, I think they estimate. And I knew that unless that ramp went up, that we were both going to die there. So I prayed that God would give me the strength. I asked for the strength to save this man. I wasn't really concerned about asking for my life, but I wanted to save this guy. And the ramp went up. And so we have no reason to know why that ramp went up. But it did go up, and that Higgins boat backed out and moved to another position on the beach. It could have been because the firepower in that area was so terrific that, it was just impossible. Or it could have been that they realized they were in the wrong spot and moved. But whatever the reason was, it went up. And I took the guy and I crawled with a broken back till I could get that guy back out to the beach. And I tried to go back in again, but I couldn't walk, and I was kind of crawling in the water to get to a guy that his arm was off, just little strings of holding his arm. And he was, every time the waves come in, his arm would go like this, and he would try to reach it with his good hand to save it from being washed away. So I got to him by crawling or whatever I did. I got to him and pulled him back enough away from the waves that he wouldn't be washed out in the ocean, and gave him a shot of morphine. And I told him, I said, look, you're going to be okay. We'll get you out of here. And he died in my arms. I was holding him, and he died there. And so I was getting weaker at that time. And I went back over, crawled back over, half walking and half, I don't know, I was moving. And I got back over to where I could talk to Myers again. And we saw, the only thing that we could see on the beach was a big rock. And we didn't know at the time that was German concrete, but it looked like a rock, and it worked out. And so I told Myers and some of the other guys to start taking the wounded down to that rock and get behind that rock. It was the only thing on that entire beach area that you could get behind. There was nothing else there to give you any protection. So we were able to get the guys started over there, and then on the third wave, the regimental aid group had come in, and they were at that time down east of us and beginning to try to find a place where they could set up and treat some patients. So I tried one more time to go in and get a guy, and I couldn't make it. So I went back out and talked to the guys again and said, I can't go any further. I was very weak, bleeding terrible, and my back was bad. So I passed out there on the beach.
What do you remember next?
I don't remember who picked me off the beach, but the next thing I knew, I was on an LTT, which is the landing tanks, you know. They have the big belly, as we call it, where they can open up, put tanks in there. And that was full of guys on litters, and I was put on the upper part of the boat on a litter, a stretcher, we call it. And so a Navy doctor came around and looked at my dog tags, and he says, we have another Lambert on here. And I knew that it was my brother because we were the only two Lamberts in the 16th Infantry. And I asked him, I said, how bad is he? And he said, we may have to remove his arm and leg. And I said, please don't. You know, why? I don't know what. I just said, please don't. And they gave me a shot of morphine, and we eventually ended up back in Weymouth there.
And then you stayed in the hospital for a really long time.
Yes, I was. When we got to Weymouth, they started unloading the wounded off there onto the dock, and I was on a stretcher on the dock, and they brought out another guy and put him down next to me, and I didn't recognize it. It was my brother, but they didn't know that. But I didn't recognize it. He was as white as that paper, and his clothes were bloody and torn, and so I didn't recognize it. And they put us in an ambulance and took us to a field hospital that had come over from the States and set up a big, huge tents and things and made a hospital out of that all American doctors and nurses. And they took us off when we got there out of the ambulance. And all the staff, we were the first two to go to that hospital. And all the staff and doctors and everyone was out to see, I guess wanted to see what two shot up guys would look like. So they took us in the operating room and cleaned us up in there and dressed their wounds best. I was out first because my brother was so much more damaged than I was. And they put me in a cot out in a ward. And later they brought him out after several hours. And they gave us something and we both fell asleep. And the next morning early, my brother woke up and that's the first time he realized that I was there. And he said to me, "What's Mother going to think?" Because she had notices that we were both wounded in Africa and both, again in Sicily. And so we talked a little bit and they gave us a little food and then shipped us out of there to different hospitals. And I went to a hospital in England, Cheltenham, England, and I was there for about 8 months before I could walk very well.
Have you dealt with back pain ever since?
Yes, my back has always bothered me, but luckily over the years, I've been able to do quite a lot of things that I wanted to do with that, even play some golf. And I established my businesses and ran those. So I still have pain with my back. That's why I took the medication this morning. And but I've lived with it, and I have a lot to be thankful for, that I've gotten this for at 99 years old. And I will continue on doing the things that I do, helping people and working with our future soldiers and things until the day I die.
When you think back to that first wave, I would guess there's a number of things that could come to mind. How it was almost impossible for that first wave to make any progress, but at the same time, nobody was giving up.
Right.
So what do you think about when you think about that day?
Well, when I think of that, I think of how brave our young men are, and everyone that landed on that day was meeting an impossible situation. The engineers had gone in ahead of the first wave to try to destroy some of the hazards in there that we'd faced. And when we went in, the beach was littered with dead. Those guys, I think, were all killed. And I think about how these guys, what they were doing, putting their life on the line for their families and their country, and how much this, I hope, someday will mean to other people. But it was just absolutely, your mind was on what you were doing. And the reason that I had trained my men that way, because if you're thinking about what your training is and what you're doing, it keeps your mind off of a lot of the danger and things. You're not looking out there and seeing that. And that's the way I was, is to keep my mind on what I was doing rather than to look up and get frightened or something of what we saw. It's hard to explain feelings at a time like that, because your feelings are not normal. And so that was the type of thing on the beach there.
I'm also struck by the selflessness. You were talking a little bit earlier while you were trapped under the Higgins boat ramp. Well, I'm okay for the most part if I don't make it, but God, please help this man that I'm trying to save.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. And they may have been common among the other men on the beach, but in our general culture, that's remarkable.
Well, I never thought of much about that. It's just what my job was, and that's the way I am. That's the way Ray Lambert is. That's the way I am today. I feel that my responsibility is to do everything I can to help someone else. I sacrificed myself in the war for that reason. And since I've been out, I contribute every way that I possibly can to crippled children and wounded warriors. And it's just the way I am. I realize everyone is the same way, but we can't be, it's very difficult for me to be, to a point, like you mentioned, selfish, to be a selfish person, think of myself before someone else. It's just not the way I am.
Mr. Lambert, it's an incredible legacy and an incredible story from 3 different theaters that you've shared with us today. Thank you for being with us, and I can't thank you enough for your service to our country. It's an honor to have you with us.
You're very welcome.
Ray Lambert is a U.S. Army veteran of World War II, from North Africa to Sicily to Normandy, serving as a medic. I'm Greg Corumbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.